We now welcome back to the airwaves Eylon Levy, the former Israeli government spokesperson who is so almost ubiquitous on social media, a real warrior for his country over the last year and a half in particular. Eylon, it's good to have you back on the show.
Hello, Guy. Good evening.
So I just want to first get your take and just take the temperature of your country as you join us from Tel Aviv about the results of the release of Ydan Alexander this week. I know many Americans were very relieved to get him back and out of Hamas captivity. He was held for almost 600 days, a dual citizen, U.S. and Israel. A big moment. Of course, there are still hostages trapped in Gaza. Is the national mood changed, heartened because of this, or is it still solemn because of the remaining hostages? How do those emotions work?
It's a mix of everything. There is an incredible sense of relief that Ydan Alexander was freed from the dungeons of Gaza, especially as we've learned what happened to him underground. We know that he was tortured when he was interrogated, that he was covered in fleas, that he had a bag over his head, and that he was cuffed. He endured the most horrific conditions, and now he's free and with his family, and that's fantastic news. But at the same time that Israelis are happy for the Alexander family, they are also extremely worried for the other 23 living hostages in the dungeons of Gaza, and for the families of the other 35 hostages who have been murdered, and Hamas is holding onto their bodies for a ransom. And you know, Israeli society now faces some impossible choices, because we want to do two things. We want to bring back the hostages, and we want to stop Hamas taking more hostages tomorrow. But Hamas is holding onto those poor hostages for a ransom, demanding the release of thousands of terrorists from jail, demanding an end of the war that will allow it to rebuild its tunnels and its war machine and prepare for the next massacre. So relief for the Alexander family, but a lot of anxiety.
You know, I saw a headline about the IDF striking what they believed and had intelligence was an underground bunker where they had reason to believe a key still surviving Hamas leader was staying. And the location of that bunker, Eylon, unsurprisingly to you, and unfortunately unsurprising to anyone who pays attention to the conflict, was underneath a hospital. And over again, I feel like we have to say it repeatedly because many of the resulting headlines, whenever there's an operation around or in a hospital or a school or a mosque or a neighborhood, much of the international press just says, Israel attacks hospital. And then they quote the usual suspects who come out to denounce it as some sort of anti-humanitarian, egregious act of genocide and breaching the rules of war and all of that. And they quote the Gaza Ministry of Health with some made-up death count. Of course, that would be Hamas. And almost without exception, they either minimize or don't mention at all the fact that terrorists were deliberately operating out of these civilian areas like hospitals on purpose in order to generate headlines like this if Israel ever were to attack them where they're operating. I don't understand how it is not a standard practice in journalism around the world for anyone who pretends, at least to be fair, to lead with that reality every single time.
Well, you are so right. The public has been let down tremendously by the legacy media, which have chosen to completely ignore the way that Hamas is fighting this war. And so you get those horrific headlines and the blame cast on Israel because people don't want to understand the trap that Hamas laid. It is no accident that Hamas fights from inside hospitals and schools and mosques. It knows exactly what it is doing. Hamas hopes to get permanent immunity for its terrorist leaders by hiding in a basement. Because one of two things happens, right? Either Israel attacks, and then there is negative coverage from journalists who don't even want to acknowledge that terrorists were hiding inside a hospital, or Israel says, we'll back off, and the terrorists live to fight another day. It is a war crime for a terrorist warlord to wage war out of a hospital. I don't know why this needs to be stated again and again and again. It's a war crime. Hospitals are meant to be places of healing and recovery. Terrorists are not meant to operate there. And when they do operate there, under international law, you are allowed to target them. They don't get immunity just by hiding in the basement of a hospital. And you know, the people of Gaza have been let down hugely, not only by their leaders, the Hamas government, which strategically stations underground military bunkers under their hospitals, but also by the international community, by the UN, by diplomats, by media, who choose to ignore the way that Hamas has totally militarized and weaponized the whole of Gaza's cityscape and brought such misery onto the people of Gaza because they choose to use those civilians, not as human shields, Guy, as human sacrifices, hoping they will get hurt and hoping that those images are going to force Israel to stop, to back off, to abandon the hostages, to leave Hamas in power so it is free to plot another 10/7 massacre.
Yeah, and you see some people who are ignorant who at least have been led to believe that the Israelis just want this war, that they are, bloodthirsty and don't care about humanity or civilians, and they are rapacious and want to take over Gaza because, this is what they do. They're colonizers. All of these stories bearing no resemblance, of course, to reality. The fact that Israel forcibly removed its citizens from Gaza, giving it entirely over to the Palestinians 20 years ago. And they have been rewarded for that attempt at land for peace with 20 years of attacks, including the most horrific one in 2023 that you just mentioned on the 7th of October. The Israelis don't want this. They didn't ask for the war. They didn't start the war. They would love for the war to be over. They just want the hostages back and for Hamas to surrender, which it will not do, which puts all of the blame morally, militarily, etc., on Hamas, and yet there are a lot of people who obstinately refuse to see that. And one of the problems, you talked about the media letting them down. You know this as well as anyone else, Eylon, but I think we have to pause here for a moment and highlight this fact. Some of the journalists, well, many, I'll say, of the journalists who operate in Gaza do so either living in fear of Hamas. So if they tell too much truth about what's happening on the ground in ways that are inconvenient to Hamas, they could very much be in grave peril themselves. And then some of these journalists who wear, these flak jackets that say press across them and have their little press credential, you then find other video and photos of them clearly actually participating in Hamas terrorism. They're members of the terrorist group themselves, masquerading or moonlighting back and forth, right, as journalists and then terrorists. This is another trick that is used repeatedly for propaganda purposes.
And it's wild that the media don't understand this, that they don't cover the Hamas terrorists who are disguised as doctors, the Hamas terrorists disguised as journalists. They're taking everyone for a ride and people are going along with it. The media refuses to understand the complicated conditions that Israel is fighting in and how difficult it is to target terrorists when they wear not only civilian clothes but often disguise themselves as humanitarian workers. But I want to come back to something you said earlier because I think you really hit the nail on the head. This war could have ended on October 8th if Hamas surrendered, freed the hostages, and laid down its arms. Both terms are still on the table, and that is what the world should be demanding. And what really makes my blood boil is the caricature we see of Israelis, as if they want war, as if they're bloodthirsty, as if they want violence. Nothing could be further from the truth. Let me bring you in. I went just the other day down south, right to the Gaza border, to a military camp to join one of the many barbecues that civilian volunteers are putting on for the soldiers to raise their morale. Now, these soldiers are either 19-year-old conscripts or they're reservists. It means they have real jobs, wives, husbands waiting for them at home. Maybe they were starting an academic degree when October 7th happened. Maybe they had a business. Maybe they had a job. Guys, some of these chaps have done over 500 days of reserve duty in the last 19 months of war. Their lives are on hold. And when I talk to them and ask them how they feel, they say they want this to be the last Gaza war. They want to win this thing and crush Hamas so that there won't be a next Gaza war. And that's the dilemma the world doesn't want to engage with. There is intense pressure on Israel to back off, to leave Hamas alone, when we know it will rebuild its tunnels and we know it will rebuild its rockets, and the next war will be a matter of time. And these soldiers are saying they want to bring the hostages home, and they want to make sure that they're not going to have to do another 500 days of reserve duty when Hamas rebuilds its military. They say this ends now. Enough is enough. Not because we want war, but because Hamas exists for the sake of war.
Yep.
And so for the sake of peace, it must go.
And the problem is a lot of the people on the other side of this issue don't actually want peace. They might use words like peace and ceasefire, etc., but they are actually pro-war. They just want Israel to lose it, right? I mean, so it's sort of hard to reason with people who don't believe that the state of Israel should be allowed to exist at all and would be perfectly happy to see it wiped off the map with vast ethnic cleansing, even genocide, which they also pretend to oppose. And I'm talking about their supporters in the West and certainly of Hamas itself, right? That is their stated position that they have lived out with their actions repeatedly. And unless you want Israel to be suicidal, which some people do, but most of us here don't, there's no alternative but to win. The question then becomes, Eylon, and this is, I know, a thorny one and not a simple one. There's this discussion when I was in Israel last year and among Israel supporters in the U.S. as well, this discussion around the day after and what the day after looks like. And the day after meaning when the war is finally over, God willing, with all the remaining living hostages brought back safely, we pray. But when the war ends, what happens next? I'd love to get your analysis on that, and also a message to Americans about why we collectively should care about the fate of Israel and our alliance. Eylon, I was asking about what comes next after this war. I don't have a great answer to that because it seems like a lot of bad options. I know the Israeli government has put out one suggestion that was instantly pilloried by many in the international community because that's what they do to Israel. President Trump said something very provocative that maybe changed the paradigm of the conversation a little bit a few months back. What is, at least in your mind, a realistic view of what could happen next in Gaza?
That's a very good question. And it's important to clarify the day after means the day after Hamas. Because if this war ends with a hostage deal, with Hamas still in power, there can be no reconstruction, okay? Gaza cannot be rebuilt while its government says that Israel should be destroyed. There is no way to peacefully rebuild Gaza. The reconstruction of Gaza will mean the reconstruction of Hamas. And so I think three things need to happen. And Prime Minister Netanyahu set this out at the beginning of the war. He called it the 3 Ds. You need to have the destruction of Hamas, the demilitarization of Gaza, okay? It can't be used anymore as a launch pad to shoot rockets at Israel or stage invasions of our communities. And you have to de-radicalize Palestinian society. The elephant in the room is that when the October 7th massacre happened, it was extremely popular inside Gaza. Hamas has had 17 years to poison the minds of Palestinians, and many, maybe not all, but many, think that Hamas's ideology of violent struggle against Israel as some illegitimate colonial state, a permanent jihad against it, they think that that is justified. Now, that ideology has to end, or there is no way that we can have peace with Gaza. Now, notice that when we have world leaders talking about a permanent ceasefire isn't peace. There's no such thing as a permanent ceasefire. If you want the fighting to stop between Israel and Gaza, the people of Gaza need to accept that Israel exists for good, that it's legitimate, and that they cannot keep waging jihad against it in order to destroy it. So look, who's going to govern Gaza? It's a very difficult question. Israel certainly doesn't want to govern the Gaza Strip. Personally, I think the solution is going to have to be some form of international trusteeship, a council of foreign states that take responsibility to govern Gaza, unless and until there is a local leadership that says it wants to rebuild Gaza and live in peace next to Israel. But I don't think we're there yet.
And one other note, the permanent ceasefire that you were just talking about, well, that existed on October the 6th. And then we know what happened the next day. So it's valuable until it's not, and in fact can be dangerous because it allows, during the ceasefire, for the terrorists to rebuild, regroup, and plan mass destruction, which is what happened in 2023. Finally, Eylon, I want to just not exactly put you on the spot here, but ask you to offer a word to some of our listeners here in the United States. I'm, of course, extremely pro-Israel, a very proud Zionist. I view this struggle between Israel and Hamas as close as it gets to pure good and evil, black and white, when it comes to a moral issue. We know that there are people who are sympathetic toward or openly supportive of Hamas. I don't want you to talk to them. in this answer. It's to the Americans who might be generally sympathetic toward Israel, certainly not fans of Hamas or the terrorists, but kind of think, is this worth all of our trouble, all of our attention, so much money? What exactly are we getting out of this? There's an America First strain that is not hostile or anti-Israel, but is just skeptical, kind of like, we wish them the best, but leave them alone to do it on their own, and we shouldn't get involved. I wonder what you make of that and what you would say to those Americans.
You know, America just marked Victory in Europe Day. I think President Trump rebranded it as Victory in the Second World War Day. After very difficult fighting in the Second World War, and all Israelis want is the security and safety that Americans take for granted as a result of what you so heroically did 80 years ago. Now, Israel is protecting America. Israel is not asking for American troops on the ground. We don't want anyone to fight for us. All we want is the ability to defend ourselves. And we are standing up against some of the worst people in the world, including many who, until we eliminated them, had American bounties on their head.
Yep.
Take the leadership of Hezbollah, Israel eliminated in Lebanon, wanted for the horrific attack on the U.S. Marines in Beirut in the 1980s. We're talking about people who are at the top of America's most wanted list, who Israel is taking down one by one. And through its technological power in the Middle East and dynamic economy, Israel is able to be the eyes and ears of the United States in the Middle East in terms of intelligence and having leads deep inside terrorist organizations and able to tell the United States when there are terrorist threats. And it is only Israel that is standing up now to Iran as it is about to acquire a nuclear weapon. And an Iranian regime that chants death to America, that has nuclear weapons, Guy, that's not a safe world for the United States. That is a direct threat to the United States.
Correct.
And Israel is the only country on the ground that is standing up to this anti-American bullying.
And this is why, to me, being pro-Israel actively is profoundly America first as a matter of foreign policy and national interest. In addition to all the good moral reasons to support Israel, it's also deeply within our self-interest to maintain this rock-solid alliance for the reasons you just stated. Eylon Levy, former Israeli government spokesman, joining us today from Tel Aviv, Israel. Eylon, as always, we appreciate your time.
Thank you, Guy. Anytime.